I love my natural hair because I'm an uppity African. I love my full lips with red lipstick because I'm an uppity African. I love reading books because I am an uppity African. Uppity African. Uppity African is what Tyla was called after she jokingly asked her colleague to hold her award during the VMAs, an American music award show. Many other artists have actually done the same in the past, and there wasn't a fit that was made when they did the same, but suddenly when Tyla does the same, she is an entitled, self-important and snobbish African. I wonder why this is so. It does come as a shock to some people that it was a black American that actually called Tyla an uppity African. But if you remember, it's just been a few weeks when a black American man denigrated the South Sudanese basketball team, insinuating that they were not qualified enough for a tete-a-tete with the American team. He believed that the South Sudanese were wearing shoes that they received thanks to the charity of the Americans. Hearing black Americans denigrate Africans in this manner might come as a shock to some people, but it really isn't, because at the end of the day, they come from first world countries and they are socialized to think that they are better than everyone else. And of course, before I continue, I know it's not all black Americans who say these things or who even believe that they are better than Africans, but isn't it fascinating that people that look like Africans are participating in the practice of humbling Africans as colonizers have always done? While receiving her award at the VMAs, Tyla graciously called for the recognition of the diversity of African music because, of course, it is news to some parts of the world that Africa is not a country. Africa has over 2,000 languages spoken with rich cultures, of which music is a huge part of. This means that for a lot of people outside of the African continent, they have little to no literacy when it comes to African music, other than Afrobeats, which has been conveniently whitewashed to be palatable for the audiences that refuse to acknowledge that Africa can be complex or multidimensional. Isn't it interesting that when an artist from a Western country receives global success, they are told that they are talented and they've put in a lot of efforts, but when an African artist achieves the same, they are expected to be grateful for a global platform? It's as if those from developed countries have a right to global success, but Africans have to ask for permission. And this reminds me of a certain company I was working for in France, where the CEO, in one of the last conversations we had before I left, told me that he was very disappointed in me because I wasn't behaving like an African. He said that I wasn't showing how grateful I was for that job opportunity, and I found this quite surprising because I was very much overqualified for that job in that startup company, yet I was the only one who was expected to be grateful for this job opportunity. My French colleagues were not expected to have this gratitude and be stroking the ego of this insecure man who just happened to be CEO because he had easy access to funding. This man also believed that women deserved to be paid less than men because women go on maternity leave, and I found this so surprising because he was just newly married and he wanted to have children. How can you want to benefit from women but also want to treat women like they're less than? Needless to say, the company actually died, closed shop 2 months after I left that company. I left with one compliment from that man: I am too smart for my age. I guess he was very angry that I, a young, smart African woman, had the audacity to actually make it known to him, a man who was grown up in a first world country, that he's not good enough. Only he'd listened to me, he would still have the company, but oh well, who cares? He will be given chances over and over, no matter how times he fails. He's from a first world country, and I, an overqualified African woman, I have to show over and over how good I am, and I have to play small to make people from first world countries not feel some type of way. That experience really made me think about how a lot of Africans do not have the privilege of wasting a lot of time and other people's money by starting a lot of companies that have no business to exist because they don't even serve a purpose in the business market. But a lot of these people exist in first world countries, and instead of them seeing this as an unearned privilege, they see it as somehow being better than Africans. A lot of brilliant Africans have a lot of difficulty with getting funding because African countries are seen as high risk, and yet those in first world countries have ease of access to funding because, of course, their countries are seen as low risk. These are skills that were designed by first world countries, which makes this more interesting because you're trying trying to make fun of Africans for being poor, but you're the one that came up with the idea that Africa is poor. How do you think the world would look like if it was built on the equality and equity of everyone in all continents? Some countries that call themselves first world countries wouldn't even be seen on the world map. Imagine this. Despite the continuous oppression of African people and of the African continent, Africans still dominate the global stage. Despite all the hurdles that they put for the African people still shine. Despite all the visas they reject, African people still travel the world. There are first world countries that hate Africans, and yet their most successful sports people and even artists are from Africa. And I think this is why a lot of these countries are so scared of Africa, and why they do everything possible to ensure that they keep Africa in its place. They're obsessed with interfering with African issues, whether it's politically, socially, economically, because of course they know that Africa can thrive without the rest of the world. The rest of the world cannot survive absolutely without Africa. I am highly interested in the book publishing industry because I want to publish my own books someday. And recently I picked this book and I saw something that really reminded something very important when it comes to the relations between the West and Africa. One of the reviews, I think it's from the listener if I'm not wrong, I mean it's an old book clearly and some words have actually gotten lost, but it says Kamari's story is important for those who would understand a continent in turmoil. It reminded me how a lot of African writers were actually venerated by the West as those who only write about African suffering. It's almost as if you're an African author who wants to get the recognition of the West, you have to play into this image of a dejected continent so you can give them an excuse to save you and they can help you to sell your story, and oh my god, so that everyone in the world can know how much suffering and struggle you've gone through to even be able to write a book. It's as if being an African and being an author who is from Africa is something that is so shocking to them, because you are going through so much suffering. How did you even have an idea, sit down and write about it? If this is a prerequisite for global success, then I don't think I will become a global success as an author, because I'm not interested in painting Africa as this continent that is just full of suffering. Of course, I'm not going to be one that is going to paint Africa as some sort of heaven, because it is not. But let's not pretend that Africa is the only continent that has a lot of suffering. I have lived in a first world country and also traveled to other first world countries, and I know for a fact that there's also a lot of suffering there. There's a drug crisis, they have unemployment rates. I mean, right now there are many people who are living paycheck to paycheck in these first world countries. Mental health crisis, police brutality exists in these countries too. People in first world countries also die from disease. I mean, if they were really first world and developed, they would be immortal, wouldn't they? So no, I'm not going to be so uppity as the people in first world countries have always been, to think that they are better than others and expect that African writers only write about suffering. I'm going to be the kind of writer and poet that really puts at the forefront African complexity, because as Africans we are complex, we are multi-dimensional beings. I believe that those in the first world countries have no right to speak about the poverty and suffering of Africa, because they conveniently say that this is Africa's fault, because they don't want to take responsibility for how their countries contribute to African poverty. The fact of the matter is that African poverty is what makes you a first world country. When developed countries start acknowledging how they benefit from the exploitation of Africa, then yes, you can point a finger to Africa's shortcomings. You can tell us about how we have the worst leaders all day long, but also tell us about how your governments do everything possible to get rid of visionary African leaders. If Tyla wasn't African, her act of asking somebody else to hold her heavy a word for her would have been praised as her being feminine and soft, and there would have been social media trends asking women to be in their feminine energy, to be soft, to ask for help. But because she's African, she's simply entitled and arrogant. Isn't it interesting how when these Western countries, when they painted themselves as first world countries, developed countries, and Africa as a poor continent, they used their own scales of measure? And isn't that the best example of being uppity? When these people from first world countries travel to other parts of the world, they expect the red carpet to be rolled out for them. They call themselves expats. They create gated communities for themselves themselves. They refuse to learn local languages. They even want to stay away from local cultures as much as possible. But when Africans go to first world countries, Africans are expected to shed all their identities and assimilate, take on the identities that they are given in these first world countries. They expect you to learn their language. They expect you to do things as they want you to. They will even call you an immigrant and treat you as if you're some sort of a disease, as if Africans are supposed to ask for permission to go to other countries, but these first world countries just go to other parts of the world because it's their right. It's as if Africans are just supposed to be very grateful to people in Western countries for being given permission to be alive. And perhaps as Africans, we need to learn from the West. We need to learn to be uppity, to be entitled, snobbish, self-important, because uppity makes you first world.